Thank you, Paul, and thank the organizers for arranging this event. I became aware of the Hmong situation many, many years ago, although wasn't involved in it. And then my son goes to UC Merced, just up the road, where there is a very large and very active Hmong community that is a cultural and civic group. They perform at events and they help raise the issue of Hmong culture at UC Merced. So it was a very encouraging, in a way, when the Hmong community here approached me about addressing the situation of the Hmong people, but at the United Nations, where I have been a delegate for 35 years. After having worked with a number of organizations, it was particularly gratifying to work on the Hmong situation because, as I say, I remember the situation from the Vietnam War and was aware of the unexploded ordnance and other situations affecting Hmong people. When we go to the United Nations, we delegates basically have an understanding of what international human rights law is all about. And you heard me raise the issue of self-determination of the Hmong people, and you are aware of the concept of self-determination, but it's really important to be able to argue why you have the right to self-determination. It's one thing to say, oh, we have the right to self-determination, and you go and you're meeting with the press, you're meeting with your legislators, and they say, well, why? What proof? Show me you have the right to self-determination. Well, it's very important to be able to argue the law, even if you're not a lawyer. So I thought what I would do first is to set out the elements of the right to self-determination, and you will see why the Hmong people fit clearly into being entitled to the right. There are two versions of the law of self-determination. One is the classic version, and the other is the backdoor version. I will start with the classic version of the right to self-determination. A people have a right to self-determination when, in the classic term, three elements were met. First of all, there was identifiable land. So I'm sure that you in this room can clearly set out where the Hmong land is. And you can show it on a map to whoever you're talking to. This is our land. This is the land that has been Hmong for many, 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 many generations. The second element is something that distinguishes the group from others in the more or less area. And the Hmong culture is very, very distinct. It is very different from Laotian culture. The Hmong culture has many, many elements which are non-existent in Lao culture. So you have land, you have distinction, meaning the cultural attributes, language, etc. And then the third element is that you have to show that your people there govern themselves. And who else governed the Hmong but the Hmong in the Hmong territory? So the three classic elements of the right to self-determination are clearly met by the Hmong situation in Laos. Since World War II and the United Nations Charter, there are two additional elements for having the right to self-determination, and that is because of the general political and legal situation at the time of the United Nations Charter. One is the people in question have to show they have the capacity for governing themselves or exercising the right to self-determination. And I think you can also make an extremely strong case. I mean, after all, the Hmong people governed themselves for years and years and years and generations. Why couldn't they again? Plus the fact that in the exile community, there's extremely capable leadership. So I believe that the capacity for self-governance is extremely strong in the Hmong situation. And the final element since World War II, the people in question have to show the will for exercising the right to self-determination. The international community doesn't want to give the right to self-determination to a people that doesn't want it. And I think not just our presence at the United Nations, but the situation of the Hmong people in Laos since the Vietnamese War makes it very clear that the Hmong people are not going to bow to the yoke of the Laotian government, that they have the will for self-governance. So the 5 basic tests: land, cultural or linguistic distinction, historic governance, capacity, and will, are clearly met by the Hmong situation. So if you're talking to a delegate, or you're talking to your legislator, or you're doing an interview in a magazine or newspaper, you can set out why the Hmong people are entitled to the right to self-determination. Now this is what we call front door self-determination. There is backdoor self-determination, which clearly the Hmong people are also entitled to. With the concept of backdoor self-determination, the international community looks at whether or not the people in question can effectively survive abuse, etc., without exercising the right to self-determination. And here is where the testimonies, the evidence, what we present at the United Nations builds the case that the Hmong people, in addition to classic self-determination, have backdoor self-determination. When a people has the right to self-determination, the legal obligation of the rest of the international community is they must honor and respect the right to self-determination of the people in question, and they must not do anything to interfere with the exercise of the right to self-determination. Obviously, the politics of the day get in the way of that happening, but one of the reasons we are pushing so hard at the United Nations is so that other governments do not impair or impede the Hmong people in exercising their right to self-determination, and we can get the international community to the place where they are supposed to be with a recognized right. So what we stress at the United Nations is the urgency of the situation. We talk about the killings, the denial of food and medicine to the affected population, which, by the way, are elements of the crime of extermination in international law. So by raising what the Laotian government is doing, we show and prove the points under the law of extermination. one of the remedies we seek as a temporary measure is establishing a safe haven zone. That means because it may take a while for the international community to get around to recognizing the right to self-determination, etc., of the Hmong people, we need urgent measures now to protect the people on the ground. And so we are urging that there be established a safe haven area. Now, it can be established a number of ways. One, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights can push for it and help set it up. Or the Human Rights Council on its own can also do the same. But we are really, really pushing for a safe haven because the urgency of the situation is very, very high. As you know from the clips or from other discussion, I think it was other discussion, CERD, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in 2 presentations to the United Nations on the situation of the Hmong people, called the situation a red alert. So we have in 2 very powerful instances evidence of the urgency of the situation. Of course, the Laos government did nothing. However, in this last session, with my written statements, the oral statements, the discussions that we had with rapporteurs and mandate holders, the Laotian government felt compelled to raise the question on the floor. This is a first big victory for us, because if governments don't intend to do anything or they want to just, wash it over, they do nothing. They don't bring it up themselves on the floor of the United Nations. But the Laotian government was compelled to do so, not once. You saw one clip, but they actually did it again after another statement I made. I will say I got the final word, however, because the Laotian government did not expect me to bring it up yet again, but I did, and I explained in my rebuttal that what the Laotian government may be saying about other ethnic nationalities in Laos does not hold true for the Hmong situation, where there has been a continual pattern of oppression and abuse and killings that qualify as genocidal since the Vietnam War. We'll have to wait until September to see what plays out, whether Laos, the Laotian authorities, try to answer back again. The Human Rights Council can do a variety of things about the situation. The Human Rights Council as a whole could establish a commission of inquiry into the situation, which would be quite high on the list of what they can do. If they don't go that high, they can either appoint an independent expert or a special rapporteur on the situation of the Hmong in Laos, calling for an investigation. If the Human Rights Council is still too politicized, and we can talk about that a little bit also, is still a little bit too politicized at the present, the High Commissioner for Human Rights can, on his own initiative, act. So we have to talk with the governments, we have to talk to the existing rapporteurs, and we have to talk with the High Commissioner, all seeking some sort of action. This is because the Human Rights Council has teeth. CERD, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, has no teeth. The Universal Periodic Review process, which was discussed in one of the clips, doesn't have any teeth. There's absolutely nothing to compel Laos to comply with recommendations made at the Universal Periodic Review. They can just say, oh, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, and then not do it, and nothing happens. But the Human Rights Council does have teeth, and the Human Rights Council can, when it has been involved, can transfer or recommend that the issue go to the General Assembly with a view toward getting the Security Council involved, because the Security Council can establish processes that must be complied with and can authorize specific remedies, including military ones if necessary, to comply with human rights. Now, we are a long way from having the Human Rights Council send the case upwards, where real action can occur. So we have a very, very hard job to convince the Human Rights Council and mandate holders and the High Commissioner for Human Rights to address the situation. We can meet with them during the sessions, and then when the Human Rights session is not meeting, you can also send delegates to meet with special rapporteurs, to meet with the High Commissioner if necessary, to go and meet with specific governments in their capitals rather than with their delegation at the United Nations. So there is a lot of interim work, and in fact, the work is basically non-stop. It's basically non-stop. And it's also, sad to say, costly. It costs money to go to Geneva. It costs money to eat and travel and lodge oneself in Geneva. If one needs to go to see a special rapporteur who happens to live in Germany, that's expensive. And occasionally, the necessity for these actions happens quickly. So there has to be some way to cover the expenses. I bring this up because in some other situations there has been active fundraising for many years, and so there is, the group in question has available monies. But there have been human rights cases lost because the affected parties had no funds. I say that because I know that this organization intends to raise the funds so that the case can be addressed properly, with strength, with foresight. Now, in one of the clips, I mentioned Obama. I mentioned Obama, first of all, because he did, in fact, go to Laos, and he did promise US funds for the clearing of the unexploded ordnance from the cluster bombs. I also mentioned him because knowing that he was no longer going to be president after the November election, we may be able to carve out a role for him to play in the international community on the Hmong situation. Obviously, most of the peoples who have moved forward at the United Nations have governments or key people behind them. For instance, we have the freedom of East Timor, not only because of José Santos Ramos Horta, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on East Timor, and he came diligently to the human rights sessions for years. I've worked with him for years and years, and then he wins the Nobel Prize, and then he becomes president. But the East Timor situation had the government of Portugal. Now you say, well, Portugal is not a big, major country, but Portugal was persistent and stayed with the situation, and that greatly helped in the ultimate victory for East Timor. We need to find a personage, it could be former President Obama, or a country, we have no idea who that might be as yet, could be Canada, to take on the issue and to personally, as a government or as a personage, help forward the case. One of the most important roles of the Hmong community as these plans go forward is to show unity. I say this because in other situations, the lack of unity of the affected party played a significant role in having the situation drag on and drag on and drag on. For instance, in some situations, there would be 3 or 4 different groups of the affected party who would come with different non-governmental organizations and then go talk to delegates who would already talk to the other group, or maybe 2 other groups. And so the governments in question didn't know who was the real spokesperson. They didn't know, oh, if I go with this one, but what if this is the correct one? So as José Ramos Horta showed with the East Timor situation, where he was in charge, everyone knew, there were no question of splinter groups or others or anyone butting in. He led the charge. The Hmong people must show a united front. Of course, if the Hmong people win the right to exercise the right to self-determination and they carry it out, after you win it, then you can go into your own parties and your own positions and campaign on your positions, and whoever wins, wins. But before you get it, you have to show unity. If there is no unity, the case is lost. That it's as simple as that. If the international community doesn't know who is the real spokesperson, who are the real representatives of the Hmong people, there will be no action. No one will risk going out on a limb for a people that look very divided. Now this is also a little bit an element in the will. When you are united, you're showing the will, you are together, you have the same goal, you have the same vision, you're showing the will. I also want to mention that in successful wins at the United Nations, it has been won intergenerationally. By that I mean there are the elders, and there are the middle-aged, and then there's youth. There's youth. It's important that the Hmong community, as it organizes and develops plans, include all age groups and men and women in the agenda. Youth play a really important role. Of course, American Hmong youth haven't been to Laos and don't have the same vested interest in self-determination, but there is still much that they can do, and you can relate with the youth in Laos. It's not just a question of the elders, it's a question all the people together in a united front. I wish I could give you a timeline. I wish I could say to you, oh, in 3 years we will have this, in 2 years we will have this. But quite frankly, I can't. This is a new issue for the United Nations. We have the response of the government of Laos, which feels it has to say something because what's going on the floor and in written statements is just too strong to ignore. But we have to move the next step forward, and then the next step forward, and then the next step forward. Perhaps in 2 years I could give you a better timeline. You could give yourselves a better timeline. And it's very, very difficult for people to stay together, united with the will, when you don't know how long it's going to take. And I truly sympathize with you on that point, because you can't promise what you can't deliver. But one of the things I do promise is if you move forward with the plan, and I'm part of the plan, I will work very, 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 very hard to move the agenda forward. And I hope next time we get together, I can give a clearer picture of how long it might take. Thank you.